There is a profound, suffocating darkness that falls over the American Southwest when the sun dips below the red earth. Out in the sprawling, isolated stretches of the Navajo Nation, the silence isn't just quiet, it's heavy. It presses against the windows of secluded ranch houses, hiding ancient, malevolent things that were never meant to walk among us. Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. We often tell stories of the strange things lurking in the shadows. But what happens when the shadows themselves go to war? What happens when a pragmatic, hardened rancher walks into his own barn, only to find himself trapped in the crossfire between a practitioner of twisted, ancient dark medicine and a primordial cryptid of pure, unadulterated violence? Tonight, we travel to a lonely ranch at the base of the Chusca Mountains to answer that very question and to hear a tale of survival that will make you think twice about ever stepping into the dark again. Before we pull back the curtain on this terrifying turf war, please do me a favor. If you enjoy the thrill of the unknown, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the strange. And as we go through tonight's chilling encounter, drop a comment below and let me know what would you do if you found yourself trapped in Thomas Begay's barn. Grab your flashlight, check your locks, and settle in. Now, let's get into tonight's story. Caught in a cryptid turf war, the American Southwest is a landscape of extremes. Out in the vast, arid stretches of the Navajo Nation, the red earth seems to stretch on into eternity, broken only by towering mesas and deep, shadowed canyons. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but also profound isolation. When the sun dips below the horizon, the desert doesn't just get dark, it becomes a deep, suffocating black. And out there, miles from the nearest paved road or neighbor, silence is absolute. For generations, the people who have lived on this land have passed down stories of things that move in that darkness, ancient, malevolent entities that defy explanation. But for Thomas Begay, a lifelong rancher whose family had run sheep near the base of the Chusca Mountains for nearly a century, those stories were just that, stories. They were cautionary tales meant to keep children from wandering off into the desert at night. That was until the bitter, freezing night of November 14th, 2018. Thomas was a pragmatic man. At 58 years old, his face was weathered by decades of brutal desert winds and relentless summer suns. He lived alone on a sprawling, secluded ranch situated down a heavily rutted dirt road, a full 45-minute drive from the small town of Window Rock, Arizona. His life was dictated entirely by the rhythms of his livestock. He had a flock of over 200 sheep, a half-dozen horses, and 3 fiercely loyal Anatolian shepherd dogs who guarded his property. Thomas knew the desert. He knew the sounds of the coyotes yipping in the distance, the track of a mountain lion, and the specific way the wind howled through the canyon walls. He was not a man easily frightened, but in the early weeks of November, the atmosphere on Thomas's ranch began to shift. It started subtly on November 2nd, 2018. Thomas woke up at dawn, poured his coffee, and walked out onto his porch. The air was frigid, biting through his thick flannel jacket. Immediately, he noticed something was wrong. His 3 massive livestock dogs, normally patrolling the perimeter of the sheep pens, were huddled beneath the porch. They were whining, their tails tucked firmly between their legs, and they absolutely refused to come out, even when Thomas offered them food. Puzzled, Thomas walked out to the pens himself. The sheep were highly agitated, tightly packed into the center of the corral, bleating nervously. As Thomas inspected the perimeter, he found the first anomaly. Woven into the wire fencing was a large clump of coarse, dark hair. It didn't belong to a coyote, a bear, or a mountain lion. It was thick, wire-like, and smelled faintly of sulfur and decaying meat. A few yards away, in the soft, red dust, Thomas found tracks. They were massive, easily 6 inches across, but they defied logic. They looked somewhat like canine prints, but the toe pads were elongated, almost resembling human fingers, tipped with deep, heavy claws. And most disturbingly, the tracks were only 2 deep. Whatever had walked up to his fence the night before had been walking on its hind legs. Thomas brushed it off as a strange trick of the wind, or perhaps a deformed bear, though unease began to settle in his gut. But over the next 10 days, the situation escalated rapidly. On November 9th, 2018, Thomas found one of his sheep dead just outside the fence line. But it hadn't been eaten. It had been systematically torn apart, its remains scattered in a wide circle. The sheer brute force required to do that was staggering. No predator in the North American wilderness hunted like that. Then came the sounds. Starting on November 11th, 2018, Thomas began hearing things at night. It usually started around 2 in the morning. At first, it sounded like a woman screaming in the distance, a high, piercing wail that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand up. But the scream would abruptly shift, dropping octaves into a deep, guttural, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the windows of his small farmhouse. Alongside the growls, he began to hear heavy, thudding footsteps circling his house. The footsteps were rhythmic and deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. Someone, or something, very heavy, was walking upright around his home. By the time November 14th, 2018 rolled around, Thomas was operating on almost zero sleep. The exhaustion, coupled with a creeping, undeniable dread, had worn him down. The weather that day was oppressive. A heavy, unnatural cloud cover had rolled over the Chusca Mountains, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature and a rising, whistling wind. The sky was a bruised, dark purple by late afternoon. At exactly 7:30 that evening, the power on Thomas's ranch cut out completely. The farmhouse was plunged into total darkness. The wind howled furiously outside, rattling the tin roof. Thomas immediately grabbed a flashlight and his reliable, high-powered hunting rifle, an heirloom 30-30 lever action. He chambered around, the metallic clack offering a small shred of comfort in the terrifying silence of the house. His dogs were inside with him, pacing frantically by the front door, the hair on their backs standing straight up. They were issuing low, rumbling growls, their eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door. Suddenly, a sound cut through the noise of the wind. It came from the direction of the main barn, about 50 yards from the house. It was a horrendous, booming impact, like a heavy wooden beam snapping under immense pressure. This was followed by the frantic, terrified screams of his horses. Thomas knew he couldn't stay inside. His livestock was his livelihood. He took a deep breath, gripped his rifle tightly, unbolted the front door, and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind whipped violently at his clothes. He kept his flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust to the ambient darkness. He carefully navigated the familiar path down toward the barn, the cold biting at his face. As he approached the large wooden structure, the foul, metallic scent of copper and rotting meat hit him like a physical wall. He had to cover his nose and mouth with his sleeve just to keep from gagging. He reached the heavy sliding door of the barn and carefully pulled it open just enough to slip inside. It was pitch black. The horses in their stalls were kicking violently against the wood. Completely panicked, Thomas raised his rifle, clicking on the flashlight mounted beneath the barrel. The beam of light sliced through the dusty air of the barn. What Thomas Begay saw in that beam of light shattered his understanding of reality forever. Standing at the far end of the barn, near the back exit, was a figure. It was hunched over, standing on 2 legs, but it was not human. It appeared to be wearing the pelt of a coyote or a wolf, but the skin was draped incorrectly, as if it had been haphazardly melted onto a distorted, emaciated human frame. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural, sickening angles. As the light hit it, the entity slowly turned its head. Its face was a horrifying amalgamation of a decaying animal muzzle and stretched, pale human skin. But the eyes were the worst part. They glowed with an intelligent, blinding, pale yellow light, and they looked at Thomas with an expression of pure, concentrated malice. Thomas froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. The stories of his elders flooded his mind. Yi Nao Lushi, the Skinwalker, a practitioner of dark medicine who had forfeited their humanity to become something entirely evil. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but his body refused to move. The entity let out a low, clicking, chattering sound from deep within its throat, a sound that seemed to vibrate directly inside Thomas's skull. It took a jerky, unnatural step toward him. But before Thomas could fire, the entire back wall of the barn exploded inward. A massive shower of splintered wood, dust, and twisted metal rained down as a second unimaginable nightmare breached the building. Through the shattered wall stepped a creature out of a primordial hell. It was easily 8 feet tall, entirely covered in thick, matted black fur. It stood upright on massive, digitigrade legs like a dog, but its chest and shoulders were as broad as a silverback gorilla's. Its head was unmistakably that of a monstrous, prehistoric canine, complete with upright, pointed ears and a long snout pulled back to reveal rows of yellow, razor-sharp teeth. It was a Dogman. The sheer physical presence of the cryptid was suffocating. While the Skinwalker emanated an aura of dark, sickening magic and unnatural dread, the massive upright canine radiated pure, unadulterated, primal violence. Thomas instantly dropped to his knees, diving behind a stack of large hay bales just a few feet away from the entrance. He killed his flashlight, plunging the barn back into darkness, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the storm outside filtering through the shattered back wall. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing shallow and rapid, his hands gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles ached. He had just walked directly into the middle of a territorial war. For a fraction of a second, the barn was dead silent, save for the panicked thrashing of the horses. Then, absolute chaos erupted. The Dogman let out a roar that physically shook the ground beneath Thomas. It was a sound so deep and deafening it blurred the line between a wolf's howl and a lion's roar. The cryptid launched itself across the barn floor with speed that defied its massive bulk. The Skinwalker, realizing the immediate threat, shrieked a high, piercing sound, exactly like the woman's scream Thomas had heard nights before. From his hiding spot behind the hay bales, Thomas peered through a small gap. He watched in paralyzed horror as the two legendary titans collided in the center of the barn. The impact sounded like two vehicles crashing head-on. The Dogman swung a massive clawed arm, trying to decapitate the shapeshifter, but the Skinwalker possessed an unnatural, jerky speed. It contorted its body backward at a 90-degree angle, dodging the blow, and retaliated by lunging forward, sinking its teeth into the Dogman's shoulder. The Dogman roared in pain and fury. It grabbed the Skinwalker by its distorted throat, hoisted the entity completely off the ground, and hurled it across the barn. The Skinwalker slammed into the heavy wooden support beams of the horse stalls, splintering the wood upon impact. But the Dark Practitioner didn't stay down. It scrambled up the vertical wall of the barn like an insect, its limbs snapping and popping in sickening ways before launching itself off the rafters directly onto the Dogman's back. The physical destruction was catastrophic. As the two entities tore into each other, rolling and thrashing across the dirt floor, they smashed through fencing, overturned heavy iron water troughs, and pulverized farming equipment. Thomas could hear the horrific sounds of the battle, the sickening crunch of bone, the tearing of flesh, the guttural snarls of the cryptid, and the high-pitched, human-like shrieks of the shapeshifter. The Dogman relied on sheer, overwhelming physical strength. It used its immense weight and razor-sharp claws to try and pin the faster, more elusive enemy. The Skinwalker, however, seemed to fight with a dark, unnatural resilience, ignoring wounds that would have instantly killed any normal living creature. It slashed wildly at the upright canine's face and chest, its movements unpredictable and chaotic. The fight raged mere feet from where Thomas was hiding. At one point, the massive, fur-covered back of the Dogman slammed violently into the stack of hay bales concealing the rancher. The impact knocked the top bales off, showering Thomas in dry grass. He squeezed his eyes shut, holding his breath until his lungs burned, terrified that any slight movement or sound would draw the attention of the warring beasts. He knew with absolute certainty that if either of them turned their aggression on him, he would be torn apart in seconds. His .30-30 rifle felt like a child's toy against the supernatural violence unfolding in front of him. Suddenly, the dynamic of the fight shifted. The Dogman managed to catch the Skinwalker in a brutal grapple, pinning its arms to its sides. The massive canine opened its jaws wide, aiming for the shapeshifter's neck. But the Skinwalker let out a concussive, vibrating blast of sound from its throat, a frequency so intense that Thomas's nose instantly began to bleed. The sound seemed to physically disorient the Dogman. The giant canine stumbled backward, releasing its grip and shaking its massive head, temporarily stunned. Taking advantage of the opening, the Skinwalker dropped to all fours. It didn't resume the fight. Instead, recognizing it was outmatched in pure physical combat, it shot toward the shattered back wall of the barn with terrifying, unnatural speed, vanishing into the pitch-black desert night. The Dogman recovered a moment later. It let out one final, furious roar that echoed through the entire valley, a sound of absolute dominance. It stood upright in the center of the ruined barn, its chest heaving, its dark fur slick with blood, both its own and that of its enemy. Slowly, the massive cryptid turned its head. It scanned the darkness of the barn. And then, its eyes locked directly onto the gap in the hay bales. It was looking right at Thomas. Thomas stopped breathing. Time seemed to freeze. He stared into the glowing amber eyes of the massive apex predator. He could see the hot breath pluming from its snout in the freezing air. He could smell the overpowering stench of wet earth, iron, and rotting pine. For 3 agonizing seconds, man and monster stared at one another. Thomas prepared himself to die, but the Dogman didn't charge. It simply held his gaze, a clear, intelligent warning passing between them. This is my territory. Then, without making a single sound, the massive creature turned, dropped to all fours, and bounded silently out the back of the barn, disappearing into the storm. Thomas remained crouched behind the hay bales for hours. He didn't move a muscle until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the shattered walls of the barn on the morning of November 15th, 2018. When he finally gathered the courage to stand up, his legs were trembling so violently he could barely walk. The barn was an absolute war zone. Heavy wooden beams were snapped in half. Iron gates were bent and twisted as if made of aluminum foil. But it was the evidence left in the red dirt floor that truly chilled him. The ground was churned up in a massive, chaotic circle. Thomas saw the distinct, horrifying footprints of the 2 entities. There were the massive, digitigrade canine prints of the Dogman, pressed deep into the packed earth from the sheer weight of the creature. And interspersed among them were the twisted, elongated, half-human, half-animal tracks of the Skinwalker. Scattered across the floor were massive clumps of coarse black fur alongside strange, foul-smelling patches of pale, leathery skin. The wooden support pillars were covered in deep, parallel gouges, claw marks that started 8 feet off the ground and cut inches deep into the solid wood. The sheer volume of physical evidence left behind was undeniable. This wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. 2 legendary apex predators from entirely different realms of folklore had waged a brutal territorial war inside his barn, and Thomas Begay had been caught directly in the crossfire. Later that morning, Thomas called the Navajo tribal police. Officer John Benally arrived at the ranch just before noon. Officer Benally was a seasoned veteran of the force, a man who had seen almost everything the reservation had to offer. When Thomas walked him out to the barn and showed him the destruction, the claw marks, and the tracks in the dust, the officer didn't say a word. He didn't take out his notebook. He didn't offer a rational explanation about bears or mountain lions. Officer Benally walked silently around the perimeter of the destroyed barn, his eyes fixed on the massive, unnatural footprints. He stopped near the shattered back wall, looking out toward the vast, empty expanse of the desert leading up to the Chusca Mountains. He stood there for a long time. When he finally turned back to Thomas, his face was pale, and his voice was quiet and heavy. "Mr. Begay," Officer Benally said slowly, "I can write a report saying a microburst storm hit your barn. I can say high winds caused the structural damage. Because if I write down what actually made these tracks, no one is going to help you. Some things out here, we don't document, we just survive them. Thomas didn't argue. He understood the unspoken rule of the land. Thomas Begay still lives on that ranch today. He repaired his barn, bought more dogs, and continues to raise his sheep. But his life is forever changed. He never goes outside after dark without his rifle. He installed heavy-duty floodlights around the entire perimeter of his property. And on the nights when the wind howls down from the Chusca Mountains and the dogs refuse to leave the porch, Thomas locks his doors, kills the lights, and waits in silence. Because he knows the terrifying truth: the desert does not belong to humanity. We are just visitors on the edge of a dark, unseen frontier. A frontier where ancient nightmares and modern cryptids still fight for dominance in the red dust. What an absolutely terrifying account from Thomas Begay. To be trapped in the dark, mere feet away from two legendary entities tearing each other apart, it's a stark reminder that we share this world with things we barely comprehend. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and you've been listening to Channel 19 Mysteries. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat tonight, please do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Let me know, what would you have done if you were in Thomas's shoes, hiding behind those hay bales? And remember, the darkness isn't just out in the desert, it's everywhere. If you have your own stories, creepy encounters, or brushes with the unknown, don't keep them to yourself. Send your experiences to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your story might just be featured in a future video. Thank you for venturing into the dark with me tonight. Until next time, stay safe out there.